Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and public affairs. We're broadcast on KGPT Channel 26.1, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me from my blog, The Voice for Liberty, on the internet at wichitaliberty.org. The motto there is individual liberty, limited government, and free markets in Wichita and Kansas. If you'd like to learn more about the issues covered today or to contact me, please visit wichitaliberty.org. You can subscribe to the email newsletter, like The Voice for Liberty on Facebook, and follow me, Bob Weeks, on Twitter. Well, for this week on Wichita Liberty TV, if you've been looking for local talk radio in Wichita that discusses politics and you don't know of the Joseph Ashby Show, well, you just haven't been looking very hard. Joseph is the host of the Joseph Ashby Show, which launched in May 2012. It's broadcast Monday through Friday from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. on KQAM 1480 AM radio, also available through TuneIn Radio on the internet and smartphones, and there's also a podcast available shortly after the conclusion of each show. And if you've listened to the Joseph Ashby Show, you may have heard my voice from time to time as I filled in as guest host when Joseph needs to take a day off. Let's watch my interview with radio talk show host Joseph Ashby. Joseph Ashby, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV.
Thanks, Bob.
So this week, we had the end of the legislative session. Well, it's not quite over because there is the ceremonial ending day. I don't think much will happen on that. But this week, the governor called into your show. I think it was the first interview he'd had since the end of the session. And one thing that you told the governor really stuck with me, Joseph, and you're quoting you said, "I can sympathize with that, but I can't accept that." What was the context of that remark, if you would please?
Well, we went through spending and we said, look, we have a conservative legislature, you're a conservative governor or profess to be. How is it possible that when there was a $400 million shortfall after all the executive branch efficiencies and fund transfers and stuff that they did?
Because we started with $800 million, and what you're talking about, these transfers and so forth, cut that in half, more or less.
Right, which is good. You want that from a managerial perspective. Some fund transfers, is sort of a Band-Aid. Maybe you don't want to do that often. But when it came to the legislature actually voting for a budget with some spending cuts, we didn't get it, couldn't get it. And he says, look, there's three items in the budget. There's CAPERS, catch-up payments, there's K through 12 and university funding, and there is Medicaid. And he says, he went through all the reasons why you can't cut those things. And CAPERS, I understand a little bit because those are previous promises that are already made. The Medicaid, I understand a little bit because it's dependent on who applies for it.
Entitlement, if you fall within a category, certain parameters, the state has to spend on that.
And so when Obamacare goes national and everything is, hey, free medical care, suddenly you get all these people come out of the woodwork. They call it the woodwork effect, and that had happened. The state has very little control over that. If they reduce their own state spending, then they lose a ton of federal matching funds, and maybe you can make the case for that, but obviously there's a lot more involved with just cutting spending. So the only thing that really is fungible, but is the largest thing, is the K through 12 and the university, which is 67% of the budget.
K through 12 alone is like 50 to 52 or something like that.
And K through 12 is the thing that's gone up the most over the last several years, has the most funding increases. And so he started talking about, hey, you've seen what happened when I did a 1.5% cut. And I did. We saw it on the evening news. There was sob story after sob story. You had school years supposedly ending early. Now we know statutorily they have to have a minimum number of days, and they reached it. So in essence, they were cutting off some extra days. But it was
newspaper editorial writers all over the state.
Portrayed it ending early. You had principals resigning in order to save money for school district. I mean, just the most dramatic things you could imagine. And that was on the news after the increase in spending, which was substantial, was slightly pulled back. And so he says you can understand that legislators don't want to have to deal with that coverage, don't want to deal with constituents believing that they're slashing schools, even at the same time that they're increasing school spending. And that's where I said I understand, I sympathize, because that is how it's portrayed. And I've talked to people, and it's like pounding a pancake into a rock. You cannot convince them that school funding has gone up over the last several years. And so I understand it, but I can't accept that a false media narrative is deciding the most expensive policy changes in our state government.
So do you see any solution to this? I mean, not from the governor's standpoint, let's say, but from the people's standpoint.
The governor jokingly said, and the only way to fix that was for my radio show to be a statewide radio show instead of just in Wichita. It would take more than that because, for a lot of reasons, I think the number one, or the beginning of it, I don't know the end of it, because if you're a conservative, you always feel that way about media, right? Whether it be the NBC Nightly News or cable news or newspapers across the country, you always feel like you don't get a fair shake. There's been scientific studies that show that as many as 7 points in a presidential election is affected by left-leaning media outlets being more plentiful than right-leaning ones. So I don't know the end-all long-term solution. If I did, I'd be a media consultant, political consultant, and a multimillionaire. But the number one thing that has to happen is the legislators have to stop being afraid of lies being told about them, right? They have to embrace the truth. They have to be dismissive of lies. They have to point out the lies instead of thinking, oh no, I can't vote for this because what will they say about me? Especially if what they say isn't going to be true.
Yeah, and some of it is that the other side has some arguments that are kind of hard to impeach. For example, they just want more spending on schools, and they, of course, link that directly to the quality of life in the state of Kansas and the school children. So if you ever say, we need to look at a little bit differently at schools, or we need to have more school choice, immediately you're branded as a child hater, and it's just awful. And poor people like Jim Ward, I know, for example, is a crusader for the expansion of Medicare. I think a lot of people don't realize that Medicare expansion would be aimed at adult people, not children, because children have their own program. Extremely poor people have their own program. It's really not exactly what they make it out to be sometimes.
Yeah, it's pushing, the Medicaid expansion under Obamacare pushes Medicaid further into the middle class, for sure.
And so we end up with more dependence on government, when we should be looking the other way. So there we have it. So we need to take a moment off for a commercial break. I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me this week, radio talk show host Joseph Ashby. Now, Joseph, you and a lot of conservatives, like you spoke a moment ago, are often critical of the press. We call it the lamestream press and so forth like that. And I think they deserve a lot of that criticism. And I think today on your show, someone called in and said we need to do some things to try to take back the press. So sometimes we get discouraged, but you know what? I think there are some alternatives. For example, you do a great job. I know you talk about the job that I do sometimes at WichitaLiberty.org.
Which is excellent.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. We have Kansas Policy Institute, which does great work in kind of refuting the arguments of the spenders, especially with regard to education. There was Kansas Watchdog. If we could get some funders here in Kansas, we could get that back again. So there also are some alternatives there. But boy, I followed the Twitter feed during the past couple weeks. I think you were there too, the hashtag KSLEG, and there were just all these people popping up. There must have been some behind-the-scenes activity to try to get all these people to post. I don't think these were fake accounts. They were real accounts, but it was just really brutal. And I know I would post some things from time to time and really just got hammered.
Yeah, I had the same experience where I think to myself, I didn't find it to be a lot of people. I found it to be a lot of tweets from, I wouldn't guess more than about 20 or 30 people. I joke around that politics on Twitter in Kansas is, 50% news reporters, 50% or 48% liberals, and 2% conservatives. And I'm not sure why that is, because we know just by voting and voter registration that there's a lot more Republicans, a lot more conservatives in the state. I guess they just don't use Twitter. But you are right in the sense that something would need to be done to reach out more. Now, the caller on the show today said, well, what if, there was a conservative politician or governor himself writing op-eds in the Wichita Eagle or the Kansas City Star or whatever. I don't know if that's the answer. KPI puts out great information. You put out great information. I do my best to inform my listeners as much as possible. But ultimately, just as on the national level, it's hard to gain a foothold in media. I mean, you can have valuable information, but if you're not the source within the daily flow of someone's life, it's very difficult.
And I think that the traditional media really resist the new intrusions, because for them it means loss of influence, but also loss of money as advertising dollars perhaps drain away. Even Bill O'Reilly, for example, on his show, he's really dismissive of internet media. He just doesn't want anything to do with the internet, because that means maybe he has less influence and less power. One thing I want to bring up to readers is that, we have a revolving door between press and government that really troubles me a lot. Here at the Wichita City level, Van Williams, he's the director of communications, Dale Goder, the lobbyist, and Laura Gale Locke, they were all former newspaper or TV reporters in Wichita. There have been reporters who have gone to work for the Wichita School District. Up at the State House, I was shocked earlier this year when Scott Rothschild, who's been a State House reporter for the Lawrence Journal-World for a long time, he now works for the Kansas Association of School Boards. Janine Caranda, who covered the session for the Eagle a few years, she works for the Department of Revenue. John Milburn covered State House for AP. Associated Press, he went to work for the Brownback campaign. Now he works for the Department of Administration. So there's this revolving door. And I mean, if Scott Rothschild had really been critical of covering this KASB and all the school spending, would they have hired him? Or maybe they hired him because he was covering.
Because he was an advocate. Yeah, I think about this in terms of after the 2012 election happened, and many Romney voters or anti-Obama voters couldn't believe it. They're just like, well, why did so many people turn out? What is the motivation behind the voter? And somebody said that conservatives lack a voice or multiple voices who have credibility among certain aspects of voters, and it was particular among the sort of younger pop culture driven voting that Obama was so successful in. The same thing is true, like when I hear accusations to you, I get the accusations the same, that we're Koch-funded entities and we're parroting what Charles and David Koch want us to say, things like that. There is, and it's been very successful. I'm frustrated by it. I try to counteract it as best I can. There is a credibility question, particularly with right-leaning media, or including what we do, that people are able to dismiss what we say or write in a way that, for whatever reason, the older media sources are not able to. So you have people move in and out of government, and that should raise all kinds of alarm bells, right? With how they covered things previously, how they might cover things in the future, but it just doesn't for some reason, because we've settled into these niches within the media landscape where we think, oh, well, we can dismiss anything on the right because that's shock value, entertainment, Koch-funded, whatever, and we're going to generally trust what happens at newspapers, even though this former advocate or maybe future advocate is reporting.
Yeah. What's also funny is that the left sometimes says, oh, conservatives are just greedy, they don't want to pay taxes or something like that. When look at the left, and especially also with the LLC pass-through tax, they started saying, now how many of these legislators have LLCs that they own and are therefore voting for a cut for their own taxes? I say, how many of these school spending advocates have schools and are just wanting more money spent on their children, whether in fact it makes any difference or not?
Or they're employed themselves by the school.
Yeah, there are quite a few teachers, like Anthony Hensley, the dean of the Kansas legislature now and the minority leader in the Senate, and a great orator, so to speak, an obstructionist, and likes to throw a lot of sand in the gearbox of conservatives. He's worked for the Topeka School District for a long, long time, and they're very willing to give him time off in the spring every year to go to the legislature and ask for more money for schools, I guess. So, sure. It's sometimes tough, especially the attacks that we get. Sometimes when they're personal, it's difficult to deal with sometimes, but that's just what we have to do, I think, for the cause.
The thing that's most frustrating is dismissing the argument, because you might think somebody is Koch-funded or whatever, but if the argument is legitimate, then deal with the argument. Don't deal with the messenger in the way that a lot of people do.
I'd say thank you, Charles and David Koch, for funding the opposition to the sales tax last year in Wichita. And I would say also, for those people who said that Koch was just selfish and didn't want to pay sales tax or something like that, right after that they donated like $11 million to Wichita State University. So there's a little bit of discontinuity, or whatever that word is there. So, well, we've come up on time for another commercial break. I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, this week with radio talk show host Joseph Ashby. Before we finish our media bashing, you see these editorials talking about the ultra-conservative Sam Brownback. That just to me is so funny because I think I said it on Wichita Liberty TV and wrote an article that the left really ought to be quite grateful for Sam Brownback because he is not a warrior for school choice. And in many states, Republican governors over the past 4, 5, or 6 years have really been advocates for school choice programs. And except for spending cuts, there's probably little that the left hates more than school choice. The governor did sign a couple years ago a little tiny school choice bill, but he's not put his neck out advocating for school choice.
Yeah, I often say that, not just the left generally, but schools specifically. The education system has one of their best Republican friends in Sam Brownback. Not only because spending has increased significantly during his time there, not only because he took the political arrows necessary to shore up the most teachers' retirement funds and the Capers funds, but also because he doesn't want to touch it. And I've been asking him that almost since the radio show started. When he talks about getting more money in the classroom, when he talks about using resources more wisely, I kind of leaned forward and I said, well, you know, one of the ways to guarantee that resources aren't wasted is to give people options and introduce a little competition in the system. It works in every other industry that we have competition. Why not in schools? And he's never had an appetite for it.
Yeah. And, you know, this year, since we've got the block grants for the next couple of years, which basically freezes school funding more or less, without regard to how many students there are, if a school district loses students to school choice programs, they have the same funding for fewer students. True. That, to me, should be a golden opportunity to advocate for more school choice in Kansas, but it's not happening. Joseph, let's switch to national level. You know, we've got a fairly heated race for the Republican Party nomination for president.
Crowded and heated.
Yeah, crowded and heated, I think, this year with the official launch of Donald Trump and Jeb Bush and a few others. Do you have a favorite candidate so far, or who do you think is going to be in there at the end? Because some of these candidates obviously are going to have to drop out pretty soon after the Iowa and New Hampshire.
Favorite candidate and who I think might be at the end might be a little different. To me, the only two that are in the race that I would consider supporting either with a donation or a vote or a volunteer, phone calls or whatever, are Scott Walker and Ted Cruz.
I see. That's interesting.
Scott Walker has been through a lot of what Brownback has been through when reforming some things, particularly in the education system with their new union rules, and has stood the test of time. He's proven that he can win in a purple state. He's won 3 elections, including the recall election.
That was pretty brutal, too.
Yeah. And Ted Cruz, I can count on him 99% of the time on every issue. And he's more of a polarizing figure, more of a national figure, which tends to happen more to legislators over governors, because legislatures are more partisan than executives tend to be.
Well, they're on the national stage, while governors, with a few exceptions, are mostly, affecting their own state.
Right. So as far as staying in the race, because Jeb Bush has apparently got, this overwhelming fundraising ability, that just keeps you in the race even if you don't have a ton of poll support. But to me, Marco Rubio is the undoing of Jeb Bush, because he
from the same state.
Yeah, from the same state. He appeals to the same, kind of Republican establishment voter bloc. Marco Rubio has had a foot in the Tea Party camp, particularly before immigration reform. I think he would have walked into the nomination if not for that. But so he's made a lot of conservatives upset. But again, that's a more fragmented vote because there's more candidates who want to claim that mantle. I think Marco Rubio is better at everything that Jeb Bush is, and will come out on top between those two. And so I think Walker, Rubio, Bush, and maybe one of the conservatives challengers, possibly Cruz, because he's raised a lot of money too, would be in the race.
I don't know if I would vote for her necessarily, but Carly Fiorina seems to be someone who's really quite articulate, has a lot of good ideas, and she's out there and not afraid to take the questions. And I don't know, would it be pandering to think that the Republican Party ought to consider a woman on the ticket, either at the top or second level?
I would say that Ben Carson, the neurologist, pediatric neurologist. I think I might be saying that right. And Carly Fiorina are in kind of the same boat. They sound great. You appreciate their life story. They're not afraid to, they're more genuine. They don't seem very political when they talk. And so what they say is more credible to me when I listen to them talk. But since they've not held political office, it makes it really hard for you to give them their endorsement for or the top of the ticket. I do think vice president would be a potential for both of those people. Fiorina has been on the show. She did a fundraiser for Brownback, and so I'm a little bit partial to her because she is so sharp and so unafraid and to the point. I mean, she has the skills, the charisma that you need in order to run a national campaign.
Yeah, and then are we resigned to Hillary Clinton as the opponent or the Democratic nominee? There was a poll just the other day that had Bernie Sanders at 31% and Hillary at 41%. So yeah, that's not I'd be worried if I were her.
Yeah,
well, I think the big thing is that if Democrats perceive that Hillary is weak, then perhaps some others like Elizabeth Warren or others better know Democrats.
I think it would still take a better candidate on paper than Bernie Sanders to beat Hillary Clinton. Because Bernie Sanders, he's a caricature of himself, of his ideology, and so I think he does.
Someone who revels in being called a socialist.
Yes. Well, it's sort of like, Rick Santorum handily won the Kansas caucus last time in the presidential election. He won Iowa, but then late into the race, we in Kansas at those caucuses voted for him something like 50 to 25 over Romney. I don't think everybody who voted for him really thought or wanted him to be president. It was just, I want to make sure Romney knows that I'm not super satisfied with him. And I think that's the Bernie Sanders appeal right now.
So do you think Jeb Bush suffers from some of that Romney type of thought if he turns out to have staying power during the campaign?
Suffers from discontent among conservatives?
Yeah, being viewed as an establishment and kind of soft on some things like Romney was.
Yes, and the big thing about Jeb Bush is his break from politics has been possibly the most transformative in the modern era, right? He left when Obama was in the Illinois State Senate, pre-Tea Party, two establishment candidates in a row that lost presidential elections, and that's really working against him. The big difference between Bush and now and Romney in 2012 is that Romney had such a monetary advantage, such an experience advantage, and the candidates that were running against him had such large flaws, and you have much better candidates with much more money this time. So I think Jeb Bush is at a significant disadvantage, even with all this money, compared to Romney 4 years ago.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting handicap of the race. And we're out of time, Joseph, so thank you for appearing on Wichita Liberty TV.
Thanks, Bob.
Again, that's it for this week. We'll be back next week with another episode of Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks.